All right, cool. Let's get started. So I don't think we're going to be able to finish this chapter today, so we'll probably have to wrap it up next on Wednesday. So, which means our schedule might have to change a little bit, but we'll work with it. Okay, so picking up from where we left off last time. So just to look at last time where we left off, we were talking about quality. So now we're moving on to the issue of search, right? Consumers searching for doctors and pairing. So probably the most useful and powerful model of analysis combines the issue of search with our model of monopolistic competition. So to start, we can think about an extreme case where patients don't look for better doctors ever, and better in terms of either price and or quality. Now, in this case, patients and doctors would more or less be matched randomly without any correspondence to price or that should be quality, not quantity. Quality. That's a typo. And ultimately, each patient would have an individual firm demand that is basically just a scaled down version of market demand, and doctors would essentially act as if they were monopolists, since they would know that patients don't search for a better deal, and so they basically don't have any competition. They don't face any competition, essentially, right? So they basically act as monopolists in this case. But this is a pretty extreme example, right? Obviously, patients do search to some degree. All right, so let's take that as an example then. Let's suppose that patients search, maybe for example, they choose three doctors and pick the one with the best price, right? In this scenario, firms now face a dilemma in terms of choosing price, right? The price that they want to charge. They could charge a higher price, which of course means uh, potentially higher profits, but then there's the trade-off in that they risk that the patient might choose an alternative provider that is charging a lower price, right? So the typical trade-off, right, when choosing price, higher price comes at the cost of lower quantity sold, right? Because the demand curve is downward sloping. So that's the dilemma. And then of course lower prices do the opposite. They decrease profitability, but increase the probability of attracting patients. And so basically, with these two sort of dichotomous examples, we see that when there's fewer searching going on, when there's less searching, these firms are going to be more like monopolies. All right. It's more like they face less competition when there's lower search. Whereas when there's more search or higher search, the situation becomes more like a competitive market. Okay, so that's a good way to think about it, right? Is along this line. Now, something else about this model that's nice is that it allows for there to be different prices from different providers. And so what we should see is that there's a distribution of prices when there's a small number of patients search and firms have different costs. So those two things together create a distribution or a dispersion of prices. As opposed to when there's a large amount of search going on, then prices sort of converge or head towards the competitive market price, right? So that's a nice aspect of this model. It can explain, a wide variety of behavior depending on the type of search going on. So that's nice. That's a nice feature. Now, something else to consider that's important is insurance, right? Insurance can play a couple of roles here regarding search. The first is a technical issue. Um, in that insurance basically reduces the elasticity of demand, right? It makes the demand curve steeper. And the result of that is that long run equilibrium prices will be higher. And we'll look at a graph in a minute to see how this works, right? But basically, what's happening is that because the demand curve is steeper, um, it means that the tangency between the demand curve and the average total cost curve will happen at a place that's higher on the average cost curve, right? At a higher price, right? So let me just jump to the picture. I think I have it. Where'd it go? No, I thought I put it in here. Okay, I guess it's not in here. But hopefully you can picture in your head what I'm talking about, right? Maybe I could actually draw it real quick. Let's see if it's a possibility. How do I do that? Nope, that's not right. Anyway, but you could convince yourself of this, right? Draw an average cost curve, the U-shaped average cost curve. Draw a flat demand curve, and you'll see that it bumps into the tangency low at a lower price than if the demand curve was steeper, right? So hopefully you should be able to convince yourself of that. Now there's another issue regarding insurance. It can affect the incentive that patients have to shop around, right? So you can imagine a full coverage plan basically eliminates the incentive to search for a better price. If you don't have to pay anything out of pocket, then basically we have a perfectly inelastic demand curve, right? And there's no incentive to shop for price. But there's also something else that could be going on. It could be that insurance allows patients to shop for a new doctor since it doesn't cost them that much to try out a new doctor, right? So these are opposing, right? Opposing forces or opposing incentives. So it's not we're not we can't really be sure necessarily which of these incentives is stronger or has a bigger effect, but both of those incentives exist when there's insurance, right? And so if a patient doesn't have to pay much money to shop around for doctors, then they can search for a higher quality doctor when they have insurance, as opposed to if somebody doesn't have insurance, then it's going to be costlier to shop around, right? Now, this is a huge part of the literature, so there's a lot of research on this, and there's growing evidence that suggests that doctors basically practice. They choose a particular style of practice that suits their own preferences, and usually this attracts a particular type of patient that also prefers that style. So there's different examples of styles. Maybe there's one style where um, we would call it a busy office practice with standard amenities. Okay, so kind of thinking along the lines of those two different types of quality, right? The clinical quality as well as the quality of the amenities to the patients. So that might be one practice style. Another practice style might be a doctor that primarily cares for Medicare patients. And so maybe there's low amenities, but a higher rate of seeing patients, right? Really churning the patients through the office. Yet another style might be the so-called Beverly Hills doc. And this type of style might be a doctor where they see fewer patients, and therefore they have more face-to-face time with the patient. But of course, this comes at a higher price for the patient. So these are just some examples. These aren't like official styles or anything, but just some potential examples of styles, right? So these are going to depend on both the physician's preferences, right? The physician is going to choose their most preferred style, and then that's going to attract particular types of patients, right? And of course, part of the physician's choice of style is going to be financially motivated, right? Um, so if you're a doctor living in Beverly Hills or Los Angeles, right, you might be able to charge a premium if you offer some nice amenities or more time with the patients or something like that. But now, there's several studies that suggest there's less search going on when there are more doctors. So why might that be the case? Well, the author's logic is that when there are more doctors, it's more difficult to find recommendations for a particular doctor, right? So you're in a big city, there's tons and tons of doctors, and you're asking your friends, "Hey, have you been to Dr. Johnson?" They're like, "I don't know who that is," right? Um, Compare that with like a small town where there's maybe only a handful of doctors, and you ask your friend, "Hey, do you know Dr. Robinson?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, Dr. Robinson's great," right? So that's basically the idea here is that when there's a lot of doctors, it can be more difficult to get information on any one particular doctor, and therefore search is more costly, right? So that's the idea. That's the logic that the authors come up with. That's their hypothesis. Um, Now, the model we're using, this search within monopolistic competition model, it suffers from two issues. One issue is that um, it should be the case that search for price, right? So ignoring quality for a minute, just thinking about price. The search for price should be just as costly in a small town as in a big city. And the idea here is that if you're just shopping for price and you're not really concerned about quality, then all you got to do is, maybe pick 4 or 5 doctors, give them a call, ask them about their prices, and that the cost of that effort should be the same regardless of where you live, right? And so within the framework of Pauly Satterthwaite, um, the focus would be on quality since the cost of searching for price is basically constant. Another issue is that in an alternative search method, patients, kind of like in the previous example, thinking about the cost of searching, um, patients might ask friends and family for recommendations. Um, Now, earlier in the previous slide, we said, okay, well, it's going to be costlier to search in a bigger city. Um, but in terms of price, the cost of search in this way is basically identical, right? So the main motivation in their analysis is to try to explain this observation that prices in bigger cities tend to be higher than in smaller cities. And their logic, again, comes from the assumption that search is more costly in bigger cities. But there's a lot of debate still in this realm of health economics, and the debate kind of hinges on a few technical issues, and unfortunately, at this point in time, the issues haven't been clearly resolved. Um, and so, when thinking about this research, we need to be careful and ask ourselves: is it just a coincidence that the models are able to explain the data? Is there something that we're missing? Right. So that's a question we should always keep in mind when thinking about economic models. Just because it fits the data doesn't mean that it's the best model, right? It could just be luck, or there could be something important that we're missing. So another study by these guys, Devaney, House, and Saving, um, they really focused in on the trade-off between price and the rate at which doctors see patients, right? So how quickly are patients moving through the exam room, right? And what they found was that in a community with higher opportunity costs of time, right? So this would be basically areas that are more affluent, right, where patients have very high paying jobs, and so their time is very valuable, right? Um, so in these communities, doctors have lower wait times, but at higher prices, which definitely reflects the issue of having a higher opportunity cost of time, right? If these people in these communities have a really they really value their time, then they're going to want a low wait time. They're not going to want to wait very long, but of course they're going to have to pay a higher price for it, right? And then the opposite is true in communities where there's a lower cost of time, so rural communities and things like that, right? So in those communities, they found longer wait times but lower prices. And what's kind of important to keep in mind here is that these higher prices can result without a change in costs. So it's not that doctors in rural communities have lower costs than doctors in these more affluent communities. It's just the nature of the demand, right? Um, Reflecting the value of time to patients. All right, so now we're going to think about within this search paradigm. We're going to think about the consequences of incomplete search, which of course can result if the costs of searching are high, right? If it's really costly to search, then people might not fully search, right? Their search might be incomplete. Now, remember, right? Recall, so far the model and the evidence suggests that less search means higher prices, right? So Sadanand and Wild came up with a model where they have consumers searching n times. So you can think of this as calling some number of doctors. So, for example, maybe 3 doctors, and then they shop and end up choosing the lowest price doctor. Now, the more that one searches, the more likely they are to find a lower price, right? So increase n, and you're more likely to find a lower price. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, there's have been recent studies that use some really powerful econometric analysis, right? Really, really good statistical analysis. And they look at physician pricing, and they try to determine how incomplete search might affect the prices that are paid by patients. So that what they did, this was Gaynor and Polachek. They used survey data of physicians in the U.S. That were part of group practices, and their data set consisted of over 6,000 physicians in almost 1,000 different groups, in 1,000 different physician groups. And they looked at the fees that they were charging for a variety of office visit types, and a number of other procedures. And they used their advanced econometric analysis and were able to estimate some effects of incomplete consumer information as well as incomplete physician information. So as far as consumers go, um, the incomplete information is coming from their limited ability to search, right? Whereas the physician information is incomplete because the physician doesn't exactly know the patient's willingness to pay, for example, right? So they looked at the effects of both of these types of incomplete information. Whoops, duplicate. All right, so what did they find? So what they found was that physicians missed 39% of the highest price they could have charged for routine office visits. So doctors were sort of off the mark in terms of patient willingness to pay. So that's kind of suggesting lower prices than we might actually see if doctors had more information. But then on the flip side of that, they also found that patients paid slightly more than double what the physician would have sold the service for if the patient had full information. So there's a little bit of extraction happening, or there's a lack of extraction on both sides, right? The physician isn't fully extracting as much as they could from the patient, and the patient isn't extracting as much as they could possibly from the physician in terms of surplus, right? Consumer and producer surplus. And as it turns out, this actually corresponds with what the monopolistic competition model would predict. So that's good. That the evidence is suggesting we have the right model, the monopolistic competition model. And this relationship turns out to be particularly important when coupled with the informational asymmetry between doctors and their patients. Right. That's basically what we're finding here. Is that this informational asymmetry is leading to this result. So to summarize these results, basically doctors were closer to the mark in getting the highest price their patients were estimated to have been willing to pay than the patients were in finding the lowest available price. So doctors were better at getting closer to maximizing profit than patients were to getting the lowest price. So that kind of makes sense in a lot of ways, right? Even though doctors might not know the willingness to pay of the patient, they do still have um, an information asymmetry, right? They know a lot more about medicine and those sorts of things. So we're kind of touching on the issue of induced demand, but we're not quite there, right? Another interesting thing that they found was that this asymmetry appeared very strongly in almost every specialty and every procedure studied. So this was very consistent across the board. Every single fee and service and procedure that they looked at revealed this type of asymmetry in this result. Another issue that they discovered was that information was weaker for procedures that were done less often, which makes sense too, right? That's intuitive. If you're thinking about a procedure that is done very, very rarely, there's going to be a lot less information on that procedure and the results of that procedure. And what this ends up causing is that patients ultimately overpaid at twice the rate. So they looked particularly at hospitalizations because those are relatively rare compared to just a normal office visit. So they found that patients paid basically double for hospital visits compared to regular office visits, which is not unexpected, right? Given that hospitalizations are more rare than regular office visits. So evidence that supports this, right? This issue of information regarding rare procedures. All right, more recently, Chawla did this same type of analysis, but they used data on physician fees in Cairo from 1986. And he found that the average physician earned 91% of the possible maximum fee. So again, the same results, right? Physicians aren't squeezing every dime out of patients they possibly could. So that's, I guess, to some degree, good for patients, bad for physicians, I guess. And then he also found that patients paid on average 60% more than they would have if they had full information. So again, the same results. So this is supporting evidence, right? The same findings. So that's good. Repetition and what do you call it? Verification, right? All right, but then there's the issue of like, well, how do patients actually search? Like, what do they do, right? We haven't really addressed that issue. And fortunately, Olson, Kane, and Kassler, as well as Kassler et al. In the same year, did some research on how patients actually conduct search for doctors. So what they did is they surveyed over 600 households in the Salt Lake City area, and respondents were asked basically about their use of doctors, including whether they had ever changed doctors. And about 60% of respondents reported having changed doctors at some point in time. And another 10% admitted that they would like to change their doctor, but were in some way deterred or discouraged from doing so. And the reasons ranged from, being afraid of not being able to go back to their original doctor, like being punished essentially, choosing a poor doctor. There were several reasons that were listed, but there were 10% that said that for whatever reason they were discouraged from changing doctors. So, and we're given the different reasons here. So, in this figure here, we can see different reasons for shopping for a doctor according to socioeconomic status, whether it's high or low. So, high being affluent people, low being people closer to being in poverty, I guess. Um, so we see some interesting reasons here. So the top reason appears to be that their original doctor did not have an appointment available for them. The second biggest reason was that they felt that their doctor was not being helpful, followed by searching for a second opinion. Recommendations by a friend turned out to be a pretty large determinant of searching for new doctors. So that's interesting. Something we talked about earlier. A pretty substantial portion were searching for doctors that were non-traditional. So I guess this would be like holistic doctors, right? That type of thing. Whoops. Now this next one is pretty interesting, and it corresponds with intuition, I think. Care is too expensive. So obviously, those people that are lower in socioeconomic status, this was a bigger reason for them to search for a new doctor, right? Which makes sense. If you're making a lower income, then looking for a doctor that's cheaper is going to matter a lot, right? And then another interesting finding here is the next one, right? People that are friends with a doctor. Well, this is also intuitive, right? People that are in high socioeconomic status are going to have more friends that are doctors, right? So that difference there between high and low socioeconomic status makes sense. And then some other interesting reasons: same club or church, and then apparently to some degree, gender matters. So I'd be curious to see for that last one where gender matters, if that's related at all to like gynecology or something like that, or is there like a sexist bias going on where it's like, oh, I don't want to see a female doctor because they're not as good or whatever, right? Which is of course bullshit. Excuse my French. um, but all of these, nevertheless, right, correspond pretty well with intuition as well as the model, right? A lot of them have to do with costs of search, or searching in order to save money, right? Those sorts of things, right? The only one that doesn't really, I think, is the doctor's gender. Can't really think of how that would relate to the cost of search or the cost of service. All right, now hopefully you guys remember when you talked about monopolistic competition, a big part of those types of industries or those types of markets is advertising, right? Advertising plays a really important role in monopolistic competition because one of the main characteristics is that firms are trying to differentiate themselves from their competition, right? There's a lot of competition. It's not perfect competition, right? So we're not talking about price takers here. We have a downward sloping demand curve, so firms are price makers. They determine the price to maximize profit. But part of that whole strategy is to try to bring more customers to you by saying, "Hey, I'm a better doctor," or "We have low wait times," or "We have a really great waiting room with lots of televisions," right? Those sorts of things. Um, and on top of that, right, the main point of advertising is to provide information, right? So going back to this information issue, right? And as we've already talked about, both the model and the evidence suggest that when there's more search, there's basically more competition. And so we get closer to the perfectly competitive outcome, which is basically where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, right? Surplus is maximized, right? The more competitive the market gets, the bigger total surplus gets. So we would like search, right? We want more search, basically. And advertising can reduce the cost of providing this information, right? Making search cheaper. But for a long time, advertising, particularly within medicine and medical professional services, had been illegal in a lot of states for many years. And this was primarily through the 70s, but eventually those restrictions were lifted sometime in the 70s. And what kind of helped this along was that the American Medical Association sort of went back and revised their code of ethics. And their code of ethics were basically restated so that ads were ethically acceptable, except in the case when the advertisement was intended to deceive patients, right? That was still not acceptable according to their code of ethics. Now, there's some pros and cons to advertising, right? So let's think about those. Probably the worst thing, or the worst potential thing, is that ads can distort patients' choices and lead to higher prices, right? So this is kind of like think of it like the influential aspect of advertising, right? Trying to persuade you, perhaps with emotion rather than information, right? You see those Sarah McLachlan commercials where she's trying to get you to donate money to sick puppies. Really tugs on your heartstring, right? It's a persuasive motive, which might have benefits, but it also has potential costs associated with it, right? Some sort of distortion in behavior. But the good side of advertising is they can provide information at a low cost, right? That's really the benefit of advertising. Oh, I didn't know anything about this product until I saw that ad, and now I know what it is. I know what it does, and I can kind of formulate a value, right? What might the value of that thing be? A little more easier, right? Less costly. Now, of course, with lower costs of information, search is easier, right? So search increases, and if search increases, we get more competitive outcomes, i.e., lower prices. So some research on this issue, Benham in 1972 used some survey data to look at the prices paid for eyeglasses. And he designed his survey in a way that it included some states that prohibited advertising, and it included some other states that permitted it. And then of the states that permitted it, some had limitations on advertising and others had no limitations. So a nice variety. So basically 3 different possibilities, right? No advertising, advertising with limitations, advertising without limitations. And so he could look at the effect of advertising on prices, right? And what he found was that the price for glasses was 25% lower where advertising was allowed. And on top of that, firms were bigger, which was kind of interesting. And let me just talk about the bigger firm size there. So the logic or the rationale that he came up with was that when firms advertise, they basically drive more demand to their location, and that supports a larger operation. And that also, we can also think of how that might tie into lower prices, right? If there's economies of scale and the firm gets bigger, then their cost of production goes down, which would also drive prices down, right? So those things might be happening in tandem. Another study by Katie showed that there was basically the same phenomenon for prescription drugs, albeit with a smaller proportional effect. So same direction, right? Lower prices where there was advertising, just to a smaller degree. Another study, Benham and Benham, showed that higher prices were correlated with advertising restrictions. Okay, so same supporting evidence. So where there were restrictions on advertising, prices were higher. And it also reduced the quantity consumed. So higher prices, lower quantity, that's pretty straightforward. That just comes from the law of demand, right? Nothing surprising there. Another study by Feldman and Begun found that prices on average were 16% higher in states without advertising. Okay, so all these are telling us the same story, right? One other one, Quokka, found that advertising reduced the cost of eyeglasses through a parallel reduction in quality of service. So this one was pretty interesting because they found that firms that couldn't afford to advertise competed by increasing their quality, so that firms that advertised had lower quality and firms that didn't advertise had higher quality. So, I guess, what I'm thinking about right now is like, it's interesting that prices are lower when firms advertise because advertising costs money, right? So that increases the cost of production. So yeah, it's an interesting finding, but I guess that makes the result even stronger, right? Um, Advertising must be reducing prices because of search, right? Because all other ways that we think of advertising should make us think, well, that would probably increase price, right? It costs money to advertise, and on top of that, advertising should increase demand, which would increase price, right? But that's not what we see, right? We see lower prices. So it seems like the appropriate explanation is that lower prices are the result of better searching, which was the model's prediction anyway. So pretty interesting results. There's some other interesting puzzles that kind of revolve around this question. So one study found that advertising by dentists appears to be much more common than advertising by physicians. So that's something to investigate, right? Why is that the case? Why do dentists advertise more than physicians? Well, it could be that when physicians advertise, they either do so because they're in direct competition with some sort of non-physician firm, right? So, if a patient is looking to quit smoking, there are alternatives to doctors. And so doctors might feel like they need to advertise to try to capture those types of customers. Um, or physicians are advertising because they have a new service to offer, which people are not widely aware of. So those are the primary reasons for a physician to advertise. Um, and so these kind of are niche markets, right? Areas where most physicians aren't really dealing with these issues, right? So that may be why we don't see many physicians advertising, is because not a lot of physicians deal with this non-physician competition or procedures that nobody knows about, right? So to think about this further, one of the most widespread examples of advertising in the medical care world involves LASIK surgery, right, for correcting vision. Um, so that's a very specific procedure. Um, at least when this book was written, it was less well known, so that makes sense why we would see a lot of advertising. People don't really know what LASIK is. It's pretty specialist, something that's pretty rare. So let's inform people about this procedure. Um, it could also be that to some degree there's alternatives to LASIK, right? Go get some glasses or get some contacts, right? So that'd be another reason for advertising that type of procedure. There's also a lot of advertising in other specific medical procedures, such as plastic surgery, right? You see plastic surgery advertising all the time, especially when you're in places like Southern California and Las Vegas. Not as much here in Georgia, um, but more than like, we see more like plastic surgery ads here in Georgia than we see like primary care physician ads, right? So, um, Supporting evidence, right? Another interesting thing about advertising, particularly particular procedures, is that most of the procedures where there's a lot of widespread sort of mass media advertising are for procedures that aren't included in health insurance policies. And these are procedures where the demand is perhaps most susceptible to influence by advertising, and these are the least likely good candidates for insurance coverage. So again, like plastic surgery, for example, insurance doesn't want to cover that stuff. It's elective surgery. If you want, a nose job, go pay for it yourself, right? So that's kind of the relationship there. All right, any questions so far? Making pretty good time. Whoops. Okay, so that's search. That's the issue of search. We're going to move on now to the role that licensure plays. And I guess actually we're still kind of talking about search a little bit, but um, focusing in on the licensing aspect now. So first, let's just talk a little bit about the whole point of being licensed, right? Getting a license. The point is to provide assurance to consumers that the doctor or physician knows what the hell they're doing, right? They've passed some sort of exam, um, or not internship, residency, right? That has proven that they are capable at their profession, right? So just like with driver's licenses, right? It's verification that the person knows what they're doing, and so it protects consumers, right? That's the idea, is that it protects consumers. Now, the interesting thing here is that the licensure is basically happening in terms of the inputs, not the output. So that's kind of unusual compared to a lot of other industries where um, when government gets involved and regulates something, they typically just regulate the output, right? They make sure that the product is safe for consumption and those sorts of things. It's not typical that the government um, imposes restrictions on the types of inputs you can use. But that's what's going on here with physicians, right? It's the physician and the labor input of the physician that is being licensed or regulated. And just like advertising, licensure has potentially both good and bad features. I think the good is obvious. We just talked about it, right? It's to protect patients, to provide patients with information that says, hey, this doctor has a license, which means that they're good to go. They know what they're doing. You don't have to worry about their competency, right? That's the good part of a license, right? It also helps. Another good aspect is that it basically provides like a minimum standard of care, right? It provides a floor, a quality floor, um, so that consumers can rest assured and feel confident in the fact that because their doctor has a license, they know that there's at least like a minimum standard of care that the doctor will achieve because they have that license, right? Another good thing about licensure is that it can increase search. And it does this by making price information seem more useful, right? When I see a higher price, it must mean that the doctor is of higher quality, right? So the price is providing more information, um, and it's more useful information. But a potential problem with licensing is that it can stand as a barrier to entry, which of course decreases competition. and that potentially increases monopoly type rents, right? Extracting surplus from the consumer. So good and bad. Um, and it's not, it's hard to say whether overall, like whether it's a net positive or a net negative, right? Is it a net benefit or is it a net cost? So some evidence on these issues. Kessel argued that licensure restrictions on entry led to monopoly pricing as well as price discrimination. So this is the bad result, right? This is the bad side of licensure. Okay, so higher prices, physicians acting more like monopolies, less competition. But we have to kind of be careful with this result. Okay, so why do we have to be careful with this result? Um, it's because the licensure creates a barrier to entry of an input, but it has nothing to do with the production or market organization of the output. So it's not exactly clear how this regulation of an input leads to these results that are essentially they're caused by market organization, right? Or the actual production of the service or product. Um, and so really what we're talking about is the fact that when doctors are required to have licenses, they're basically it basically increases the cost curves, right? So all those U-shaped curves shift up, um, and that happens for every single physician in the market because they all have to be licensed. Um, but this can't really explain the opportunity uh, for firms to price as monopolies. And the main reasons for that is because, well, there's two main reasons. The first is that physicians can and do migrate, so they do change location. And additionally, physician firms can and do substitute other inputs for those of physician labor. So, physician's assistants, nurse practitioners, those sorts of things, all of which don't require licensure, right? They just have to be part of a practice that has a licensed physician nearby, essentially, right? So, this licensing aspect can't create the monopoly opportunity, it has to be something else. There's also other economic phenomena, uh, primarily the extent of search by patients that determine whether physicians act as monopolies or competitors. So it's not really this licensing aspect that can create monopolies. It has more to do with patients' ability to search. Okay, so kind of a similar finding as to advertising, right? Um, we would think that, oh yeah, this is a barrier to entry, and so these firms would be more like monopolies. But in reality, it's less about the licensure and more about how patients are searching, just like with advertising. That appears to be the more important thing. And like I said earlier, unfortunately, we can't really be sure whether licensure is beneficial, right? Overall, it has pros and cons. Um, right. So the capability of limiting entry has some economic liabilities associated with it, in terms of, right, monopoly. Does it create monopoly pricing? Does it increase prices on consumers? Does it allow physicians to price discriminate, right? Those sorts of costs to society. But it's providing sort of quality control, right? And that's definitely something that's good, something that's valuable, right? So um, we really can't be sure. There's not really any research that can tell us so far that it's a good thing overall or a bad thing overall. So um, it could be that the potential gains in quality and the potential gains in information could outweigh the costs of monopolization, or it could be the other way around. It could be that they don't outweigh the costs of monopolization. So unfortunately, at this point in time, we really just don't have enough evidence to say one way or the other. Now, there's one other thing to think about with regard to licensure, and that's what's it called? Not licensure, but it's when doctors get a specialization, when they get certified as a specialist, that certification is completely optional. It's not legally mandated. You technically you don't have to be part of the neurosurgeon specialist association to be a neurosurgeon, but it does still provide a signal of quality, right? So again, certification is completely optional, but it is signaling a level of quality, right? It's acting as a quality signal, telling us that this doctor is board certified to be a neurosurgeon. So when comparing two neurosurgeons, I look at one that's certified and one that's not. Well, I'm going to assume that the one that's certified is a better quality. Now that may or may not be true, but it's just a signal, right? We don't really face the barrier to entry issue here, right? Because it is optional. And again, they're basically just serving as an indicator of quality. All right, now we're going to move on to the demand curve. Oh no, where'd that bullet point go? All right, well, I think that bullet point basically described a study. It looks at estimating the demand curve. And I'll put some bullet point and add it in, so that you can have it in the notes on Canvas. But the results of this, something that's not surprising, they found that the price elasticity of demand facing a typical large city primary care physician is pretty large. And they estimated it to be -3. So bigger than 1 in absolute value, right? So we're talking about a relatively elastic demand curve. Now, do be careful. Oh, there's that bullet point. Sweet. Just had the wrong animation timing, I guess. Okay, so this is from a study that was using survey data from the American Medical Association. This study was done by McCarthy. And he was primarily looking at firms in large metropolitan areas, which are basically cities that have a population of 1 million people or more. Whoops, man, all over the place. All right, so what I was trying to say is that don't confuse this elasticity with the elasticity for the market demand curve, right? With this -3, we're talking about an individual firm's demand curve, okay? And so if we look at that, an elasticity of -3, that's pretty elastic, especially compared to market demand elasticity, which is in the range of -0.2 to -0.3. Okay, so this shouldn't be surprising either, right? An individual firm's demand curve or an individual physician's demand curve should be relatively elastic because they're not the only doctor, especially in these large cities, right? So they face a lot of competition in these big cities, which means that their demand curve should be relatively elastic. People have alternatives, right? But that's different than the market demand curve, which is much less elastic, very inelastic, in fact. And just to be reminded, the market demand curve elasticity is much lower because basically customers drop out of the market entirely when there's high prices, as opposed to when you're looking at an individual firm and they raise prices, it's just consumers switching from one physician to a different physician, as opposed to when you're looking at market demand, consumers drop entirely out of the market when prices are too high. Oh no, it happened again. There we go. Let's do this. There we go. Okay, so this study actually had some contradictory results. So contrary to the previous studies that we looked at, this one found that when there's a higher density of physicians in a region, it reduced the demand confronting any individual physician. Now, this is contrary to the findings of these other studies we looked at previously, but it's consistent with the model of monopolistic competition, right? In monopolistic competition, as more firms enter the market, each individual firm's demand curve is reduced because they're splitting up the market demand among more physicians, right? So that's consistent with the model, but it is inconsistent with previous studies. But it does strengthen the belief that something other than difficult search must be driving prices higher, right? So that's kind of the key takeaway there, is that it's telling us that it may not be search actually, like these other studies have suggested, that's driving prices. Now, related to this issue is excess capacity, right? So this comes from the fact, oh, I do have that picture now. Cool. All right, we'll look at the picture in a second. But right, anytime we have anything other than perfect competition, there's going to be excess capacity, meaning that if we could get the firms to produce more, it would actually lower costs and prices, right? They could produce more and at a lower cost. They're still on that they're still on the economies of scale part of the average cost curve, is basically what we're saying. They haven't reached the minimum, right? So there's excess capacity. There's an opportunity to continue to utilize resources and benefit society, in other words. Now, this is the amount of excess capacity increases when demand is less elastic. So when the demand curve is steeper, there's more excess capacity. And so what we should see is that when there's markets where there's search, less likely to take place, and where insurance coverage is bigger or greater, it's targeting. It's likely targeting or searching for considerable excess capacity, right? Markets in which there's search that's less likely to take place, or insurance coverage is better or greater, then we're going to see more excess capacity, in other words, right? Because insurance increases the slope or decreases the elasticity, makes it more inelastic, as well as search, right? Search also makes demand less elastic. So in both cases, those lead to more excess capacity, right? Now, Hughes et al. Investigated this issue, and they found that the actual working hours and practices of surgeons was basically, there was a lot of excess capacity looking at these work hours, right? So basically, they found persistent excess capacity. Doctors were basically slacking 40% of the time, meaning that they had plenty of time to do more stuff, but because of the uncompetitive nature of their market, they were able to slack off, basically, right? They were able to charge a higher price and slack off quite a bit. Okay, so this was the picture I was talking about earlier that I thought I had put in here. Okay, so let me get my laser pointer. Okay, so this right here, right, where marginal cost crosses the average cost curve, where total average cost is minimized, that's the competitive outcome, right? That's the quantity that would be produced if this was perfectly competitive. And so that's kind of the benchmark, right? How does the actual outcome compare to the best case scenario? And here we see, right, we have an inelastic demand curve, which means that in long run equilibrium, the price is going to be P star and the quantity be Q star. which is a lower quantity than what would be an optimal quantity, right? And that's excess capacity. Um, Now, this issue of excess capacity is even more likely when we talk about managed care programs like HMOs, and we'll talk about that more in Chapter 11 when we look at those. But it basically comes from the fact that managed care plans hire surgeons in one of two ways. They either hire them directly on salary, so a flat salary, or they arrange for what they call selective contracting, which is basically like, um, you know, a physician as a contractor. So not a salary basis, but hey, we'll hire you when we have a lot of extra demand, and then when we don't, we won't hire you. Is basically what selective contracting is. But in either case, it turns out that surgeons appear to be very busy. Some surgeons appear to be very busy, while others may actually be unemployed or even retired. So we'll talk about this more in Chapter 11 when we talk about managed care. All right, now moving on to the very interesting topic of induced demand. So you guys might have heard these instructions on a bottle of shampoo or something: lather, rinse, and repeat. Right. So this is a common method of induced demand for shampoo, basically. All right. Wash your hair twice. You need to do it. Trust me. No, but that's the idea, right? And we talked about this in the first chapter as one of the really important issues regarding asymmetric information, right? The same thing happens with auto mechanics, right? You take your car to get fixed. You don't really know much about cars. So your mechanic can basically tell you, oh yeah, you need this change and you need a new this and that, and how would you know any better, right? So um, very common in a lot of different industries, especially when there's asymmetric information. Um, and this issue we can kind of separate this into sort of two different ways of looking at it, right? There's the academic viewpoint, which is wildly robust and full of discussion and debate. And then there's also sort of the policy related issues. And so this is really something that's like a really hot topic in health economics, both from an academic standpoint and a policy standpoint, right? Academics find this fascinating and spend a lot of resources studying this issue. But from a policy standpoint, thinking about like politicians in Congress, perhaps, um, it's probably the case that not many of them could even talk about induced demand, let alone define what it is. Um, Although they probably should inform themselves, right? This is a pretty important aspect of health economics, and really the main issue here is a matter of cost control, right? If physicians can just induce demand to whatever degree they want, then we're talking about medical care costs going through the roof, right? So it's really an issue of cost control. Right. And so, like I said, this issue is not limited to medical care. Happens in many industries. So even though it might be pretty widespread, ultimately what it comes down to is, from a cost benefit standpoint, it's not worth it to the consumer to try out if demand is being induced or not. It's too costly to try to figure that out, mainly because of the lack of information on the part of the consumer, right? Of course, this is only possible because of the large disparity between the information that the physician has and the information that the patient has, right? But the theoretical basis is that because of this information asymmetry, financial motive for physicians to induce demand, right? That's the idea. Now, McGuire gave us a nice definition, a very good, explicit definition of what induced demand is. He defined it as occurring when the physician influences a patient's demand for care, the physician's interpretation of the best interest of the patient. So kind of going against the hip, which basically, this definition is nice because it basically allows for instances where the physician might suggest care, right? Say, I really think you should get knee surgery, right? Some people might view that as induced demand, but according to McGuire, it's only induced demand if the doctor is suggesting knee surgery, even though the doctor doesn't really believe knee surgery is necessary, right? So that's a nice definition because it allows us to say, okay, well, this doctor recommended knee surgery, but it's not induced demand because they really believe that it's in the patient's best interest, right? As opposed to this doctor over here, he or she is recommending knee surgery, even though they don't really believe it's in the best interest of the patient. That is induced demand. The first case is not induced demand, right? So it's a nice definition because it allows us to distinguish between those types of activities or behaviors. Right, and to kind of highlight this issue even further, as we've seen before, there's a pretty wide disparity in agreement about proper treatment strategies, particularly across different geographic regions. Right, we talked about that in chapter 3 and chapter 5. But according to McGuire's definition, this is not representative or indicating that there's induced demand. And the primary reason for that is that we don't really see any systematic differences in the incentives between these regions that would explain those variations according to induced demand. So it's not induced demand that's creating these variations. It's something else, right? It's differences in philosophies or educations or something like that, right? And this guy Fuchs offered a good example of the type of evidence available on the extent of inducement. He estimated that the demand for surgical procedures in several of those metropolitan areas, right? So cities that are 1 million people or more. And he did this holding price, income, and other relevant variables constant, as well as using a predicted physician supply. So that's kind of interesting. He basically simulated physician supply when in estimating the demand for surgical procedures. You can read more about that if you want. I think it's one of the boxes in the chapter. Now, what he found was that when the predicted supply increased by 10%, the number of surgical procedures increased by 3 or 4%. So basically what he found was that supply was creating demand, which is interesting. This is a result that's kind of disquieting to sort of neoclassical economists, right? Supply can apparently create its own demand. And maybe you've heard of Say's law. This is kind of like Say's law, although I think Say's law is technically, it has a different interpretation, but it sounds very similar to Say's law if you're familiar with that. But this is, you can kind of look at sort of the debate and the disagreements that are going on within this subject of induced demand in box 7.4 if you're interested in more information. All right. So there's a lot of discussion and debate going on in this region. One argument is that having more doctors lowers the time cost to patients, and that increases the quantity demanded. Okay, so it's not that this increase in supply is inducing demand. It's not the result of induced demand. It's just that more doctors means lower cost of search, which leads to higher demand, and that's where the increase in demand is coming from. So it's not induced demand. It's just the cost of search has gone down. Another argument suggests that perhaps there's flaws in the statistical analyses that are happening. Okay, so to illustrate this point, there was a model that showed that increasing physician supply could lead to both more office visits as well as fewer hospital admissions um, through a profit maximizing substitution of outpatient care for inpatient care. But this is without any inducement. So there's no inducement going on. It's just sort of profit maximizing substitution. And this is basically suggesting that maybe there's a statistical issue, right? So this is basically predicting that the phenomenon reduced hospitalizations um, is observed in parallel with increasing physician supply, and that this is not a this is not merely a non-inducement explanation. Um, what am I saying here? Right. So yeah, this is just highlighting the statistical issues, right? This is a um, suggesting that that there's a non-inducement explanation where previously had been described by induced demand, right? So same thing I've been talking about, right? It could be that what we're observing when we see increases in demand, it could be that there's something else going on, and it's not simply the result of doctors inducing demand. Um, and so most of these studies focused on prices, and what we should see is that prices decline as supply increases, but they are commonly found to be higher in areas with higher supplies of physicians. So that's kind of counterintuitive, right? Um, and there have been several studies that offer explanations that don't have to resort to induced demand to explain these observations. Um, so basically, in a nutshell, none of these could show that inducement was not occurring, but they could show that there were alternative explanations. So you can see why there's still a lot of debate going on. Um, Basically, these studies are not proving, they can't prove that inducing demand isn't happening, but they're saying there are potentially other explanations that aren't induced demand. So it's pretty clear why there's still a lot of debate going on. All right, this will probably be the last slide for today. Um, so from this body of literature, there are basically there are a couple of ideas that are kind of emerging that do have unanimous support. So there are some things that have come about that aren't up for debate. The first is that if there is inducement, there must be some limitation to how much doctors can induce. Otherwise, they would just induce without limitation and ultimately end up owning the whole world. So there must be some limitation that we can all agree on that. Some analysts have suggested that there's a target income for doctors. So that's one explanation, is that maybe doctors have a target for their income in mind, and then they induce demand accordingly. There's others that suggest that a doctor who feels more and more guilty with greater inducement, that might be an issue, right? Is that the doctors feel guilty when they induce demand. That might be a limitation, right? And then one other study, Pauly in 1980, as well as some others, noted that under any of these models, doctors who induce at all would induce to the max. So they would basically go up to their limitation. You can almost think of it like a budget constraint. There's some limitation on how much they can induce. And if doctors do induce, then they would presumably induce to the fullest extent that they could. So, okay. That's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. So we will wrap up. We've got a few more slides um, regarding induced demand. So we will wrap those up. And then after that, We will wrap up the entire chapter. So just a few more things we have to look at. Exogenous shifts in demand, so not induced demand, something outside of the model. We'll also look at the issue of the physician acting as the agent to the patient, as well as the doctor agent making referrals. We will look at self-referral, which is when doctors refer to their own facilities that they own. And then we'll wrap up the chapter by looking at the role of consumer information and the role of payment schemes. So this will probably take up half of the class on Wednesday, and then we'll get started with the next chapter once we finish this up. So we'll have to push things back a little bit, which means we'll probably end up having to drop a chapter, but that's okay. It happens. You plan for the best case scenario and adapt. So, all right, that's all we have for today. Are there any questions? Okay, well, you guys have a good day, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Don't forget about your homework tomorrow. And oh yeah, go ahead.
About the homework, there's no submission place for it.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
you
my
like
bad.
have the assignment, but you don't have a where to submit it.
Okay, well, let me. I'll, as soon as we get out of here, I'll create that link for you. Thanks for letting me know about that.
Yep.
All right. Any other issues? Okay, cool. Well, y'all have a good day, and I'll get that link up, and I'll see you on Wednesday.
Bye.
Bye.